They had already tightened the restraints before anyone bothered to ask her name. The sound came first, plastic biting into skin. A sharp click that echoed too loudly inside the first-class cabin of Flight 9002. Conversations died mid-sentence. A champagne flute trembled in a manicured hand. Somewhere near the galley, a nervous laugh broke and vanished just as fast. A young woman sat hunched forward in seat 1A, wrists bound, shoulders pinned back by the unforgiving geometry of the chair. Her breathing was shallow now, uneven, each inhale scraping like it had to fight its way in. She was not screaming. That was the part that unsettled people most. She was quiet. How did it come to this? People would ask later. How did a girl end up restrained in the most expensive seat on the plane, surrounded by leather and polished wood and the smell of money? The answer began 30 minutes earlier, when no one thought anything important was happening at all. The cabin had been bathed in that soft, deliberate lighting airlines reserve for first class, warm enough to flatter faces, dim enough to hide tension. Outside the window, the rain slid down the fuselage in thin grey lines, blurring the tarmac at JFK into something distant and unreal. Inside, the mood was controlled, curated. Power suits, low voices, the quiet confidence of people who were used to being obeyed. Alyssa Carter stepped into that space without ceremony. 18 years old, long legs folded into worn jeans, a faded navy hoodie that had seen better days, noise-cancelling headphones resting around her neck like an afterthought. No stylist, no entourage, just a small backpack slung over one shoulder and a paperback novel already bent at the spine. She paused at the threshold for half a second, eyes adjusting, then walked down the aisle with the unremarkable ease of someone who had done this before. Not flashy, not nervous, just present. Some eyes followed her. Others dismissed her immediately. Victoria Hale noticed her right away. Victoria was seated in 1B, all posture and perfume, her blonde hair sculpted into something that required maintenance and loyalty to the right people. She had been talking to the man across the aisle about a fundraiser in Palm Beach, her voice confident, practiced. When Alyssa stopped at 1A, Victoria's sentence trailed off. She looked Alyssa up and down. Slowly. Shoes, hoodie, backpack. Her lips tightened, almost imperceptibly. That seat is worth more than most people's monthly rent, Victoria thought. And this girl is wearing sneakers. Alyssa set her bag down, slid into 1A, buckled her seatbelt with a soft click, and pulled her book onto her lap. She exhaled. Finally, still. Victoria leaned closer, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, voice light but sharp at the edges. "I think you're in the wrong place, sweetheart." Alyssa looked up. Calm, tired. She had the look of someone running on empty, not someone spoiling for a fight. "I don't think so," she replied. Her voice was steady, low. "This is 1A." She gestured toward the digital seat marker on the wall. It glowed back at them, indifferent. Victoria let out a short laugh, the kind meant to signal agreement from others nearby. None came. "Oh, honey," she said. That seat is for first class. Alyssa blinked once. Yes, I know. There was no attitude in it, no challenge, just a fact. Victoria's fingers tightened around her clutch. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, already searching for authority. Her gaze landed on Richard Collins. Richard was the lead purser, mid-40s, immaculate uniform. A man who believed deeply in order, hierarchy, and the unspoken rules of who belonged where. He had spent 15 years on this route. He knew the faces, the rhythms, the money. And Alyssa Carter did not fit the picture in his head. "Richard," Victoria called softly, snapping her fingers once. "Could you come here for a moment?" Richard turned, his expression smoothing into professional concern as he approached. When his eyes landed on Victoria, they warmed. When they landed on Alyssa, they cooled. "What seems to be the issue, Ms. Hale?" he asked. Victoria gestured toward Alyssa, as if indicating a spill. "This young lady is sitting in my seat, or at least in a seat she clearly hasn't paid for." Richard looked Alyssa over. Hoodie, scuffed sneakers, no visible designer logo. His mind made its decision before his mouth opened. "Miss," he said, voice dropping into something firmer. "I'll need to see your boarding pass." Alyssa reached for her pocket. Slowly. No sudden movements. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen, bringing up the digital pass. "I showed it at the gate and at the door," she said. "But okay." Richard took the phone from her hand before she could offer it fully. His thumb hovered over the screen. He frowned. The name read, "A Carter." Seat 1A. Status confirmed. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Doubt, maybe, or annoyance. Then he smiled. Not kindly. "This looks altered," he said. "Screenshots are easy to fake." Alyssa's fingers curled against her book. "It's not fake. That's my ticket." Victoria let out a soft scoff. "Oh, please. Do you honestly expect us to believe that?" Alyssa felt heat rise in her chest. Not anger. Something colder. Familiar. "Could you check the manifest?" she asked. "I'm listed." Richard didn't look away from her. "I don't need to," he said. "I know my cabin." The words hung there, heavy with meaning. Around them, the cabin had gone quiet. Not silent, but alert. People leaned back slightly, eyes flicking up from screens, ears tuned without wanting to appear involved. Alyssa could feel it now. The shift. The invisible wall sliding into place. "I paid for this seat," she said. Her voice remained even, but her jaw tightened. "I'm not moving." Richard's smile vanished. "Listen to me carefully," he said, lowering his voice. "We are minutes from door close. You are delaying this flight. Gather your things and move to economy, or I will have you removed." Victoria smiled again, relieved, vindicated. Alyssa looked up at him. Really looked. She saw the certainty in his posture, the comfort of power unquestioned. "No," she said quietly. The word landed like a slap. Richard's face flushed. He straightened, glanced around, aware now of the audience. "Fine," he said. "Security will handle this." He turned, reaching for his radio. Alyssa leaned back in her seat, heart pounding, hands still free for now. She stared straight ahead, eyes locked on the rain streaking past the window. She had wanted one normal flight. Just one. The cabin lights hummed. The engines remained silent. And somewhere deep in the aircraft, something irreversible had already been set in motion. The first mistake Richard Collins made was assuming the cabin would stay on his side. "Sir," he said into the radio, voice clipped and rehearsed, "we have a non-compliant passenger in first class refusing crew instructions, requesting ground security." The word non-compliant rippled through the cabin like a coded permission slip. A few passengers shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. A man 2 rows back raised his glass and took a slow sip, eyes fixed forward, pretending nothing unusual was happening. Alyssa stayed still. Her palms were flat against the armrests now. She could feel her pulse there, sharp and fast. The instinct to stand up, to explain, to raise her voice pressed hard against her ribs. But she didn't give in. She had learned long ago that volume was never rewarded. Calm was. Richard lowered the radio and looked at her with something close to disappointment. "You didn't have to make this difficult." Alyssa met his gaze. "You did that yourself." Victoria exhaled sharply, turning her head away as if bored by the exchange. "Honestly, this is exhausting," she muttered. "Some people will do anything to get attention." Richard glanced toward the galley, then back at Alyssa. The plane felt smaller now, the air tighter. He made a quick calculation. Security would take time. Time meant questions. Questions meant scrutiny. He didn't like scrutiny. "Actually," he said, tapping his radio again, "cancel that. We're behind schedule." He turned and gestured sharply toward the aisle. "Steve." Steve appeared from the galley almost immediately. Late 30s, broad shoulders, the kind of man airlines liked to keep nearby for situations that required presence more than words. "Get the restraints," Richard said quietly. The word landed hard. Alyssa's eyes widened before she could stop them. "Restraints?" she said. "Are you serious?" Steve hesitated for half a beat. He looked at Alyssa. Really looked. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't flailing. She was seated, buckled, calm in a way that felt deliberate. "Richard," he said under his breath, "she doesn't look." "She's refusing instructions," Richard cut in. "Level 2 threat." That was a lie, and they both knew it. But lies had weight when spoken by the right person in the right uniform. Steve exhaled through his nose and reached into the compartment near the jump seat, pulling out the plastic restraints. Thick, industrial. The kind meant for drunks and violent outbursts, not teenage girls with books on their laps. Alyssa's heart slammed against her ribs. "Don't touch me," she said, louder now. Not a scream. A warning. Richard stepped closer, too close. His shadow fell across her seat. "Miss, you are escalating this situation." "You're the one escalating," she shot back. "All you have to do is check the system." Victoria leaned forward, eyes bright with something sharp. "She just threatened you," she said. "Did you hear that?" "She's aggressive." Alyssa turned her head. I did not threaten anyone. Richard didn't look at Victoria, but the approval in her tone gave him exactly what he needed. He reached out. His hand closed around Alyssa's upper arm. It happened fast after that. Alyssa jerked away on instinct. Not a strike, not an attack, just a reflex. Her elbow clipped his wrist as she pulled back. "That's assault," Victoria gasped, one hand flying to her chest. She hit him. "I did not," Alyssa said, breath hitching now. "I told you not to touch me." Steve moved in. Too fast, too close. His grip locked onto her other arm, heavy and unyielding. "Ma'am, stop resisting," he barked, his voice loud enough to carry. "I'm not resisting," Alyssa said, panic bleeding into her words despite her effort to keep it contained. "I'm sitting in my seat." Richard pressed in, his knee against the divider, forcing her sideways. The cabin erupted into noise. Gasps, a sharp intake of breath from someone behind her. The rustle of movement as phones were discreetly lowered, then quietly raised again. Plastic snapped shut around her wrists. The sound was unmistakable. Final. Alyssa cried out then, not from fear, from pain. The restraints bit down hard, cutting circulation immediately. Her shoulders burned as her arms were twisted behind her back, forced into a position that made breathing difficult. "Please," she said, the word breaking as it left her mouth. "You're hurting me." "You should have thought of that," Richard hissed near her ear, "before you decided to cause trouble." They shoved her back into the seat, buckled the belt over her lap, too tight. The restraint pressed her into place, pinning her like cargo. "There," Richard said, straightening his jacket. His hands were shaking now, though he tried to hide it. Situation contained. Victoria let out a satisfied sigh. "Thank you. Honestly, some people have no respect." Alyssa slumped forward slightly, wrists burning, fingers already tingling. Her breathing came shallow and fast now, the edges of her vision blurring just a little. She tried to steady herself, to slow it down, but her body wasn't listening anymore. She swallowed hard. "You're making a mistake," she whispered. "You need to call my father." Richard laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Of course you have a father who's going to sue us," he said. "They always do." "My dad's name is Jonathan Carter," she said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "You need to call him." Richard shook his head. "Sure he is." He turned away. The engines began to hum. A low vibration rolled through the cabin as the plane prepared to push back. Around them, the first-class passengers settled back into their routines with visible relief. Headphones went on. Screens flickered to life. Champagne was refilled. No one looked directly at Alyssa now, except one person. 3 rows back, on the aisle, Ethan Brooks had not moved since the restraints came out. Early 30s, clean cut. Hoodie swapped for a blazer at some point in his life, but not his conscience. His phone was held low, angled carefully, recording everything through the narrow gap between seats. He watched Alyssa's shoulders tremble, watched her wrists turn pale beneath the plastic, watched Richard's face as he walked away, jaw set, convinced of his authority. This is wrong, Ethan thought. Not vaguely, not philosophically. Wrong in a way that sat heavy in his stomach. He hit upload without a caption at first, then hesitated. Added one line. First-class passenger restrained for sitting in her own seat. This is happening right now. The plane began to move. Alyssa closed her eyes as the cabin shifted, the sensation of motion colliding with the growing dizziness in her head. Her hands were numb now, completely numb. She tried to flex her fingers. Nothing happened. "Water," she croaked, barely audible. Richard passed by her seat, carrying a bottle of champagne toward Victoria. He didn't slow down. "Save the act," he said, without looking at her. "You'll get attention on the ground." Alyssa's head tipped forward. The hoodie bunched at her neck. Sweat beaded along her hairline, cold and sudden. Her body was screaming now. Blood sugar dropping fast. Too fast. She tried to focus, to remember the last time she had eaten, the timing, the pump. Panic made the math slippery. She needed sugar. She needed help. The seatbelt sign chimed off, the cabin filled with the smell of warmed nuts and wine. And in seat 1A, the girl everyone had decided didn't belong went very still, while the world around her pretended nothing was wrong. The first thing Ethan Brooks noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the curated hush of first-class luxury. This was heavier. Wrong. The kind of quiet that settles when something has gone too far, and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Alyssa hadn't moved in several minutes. At first, Ethan told himself she was exhausted, shocked, that her stillness was compliance, not collapse. But the longer he watched, the more the details refused to line up. Her head was tilted forward at an unnatural angle, chin resting against her chest. Her shoulders no longer rose with each breath. The faint tremor he'd seen earlier was gone. Her hands were the worst part. They lay in her lap, bound together, fingers swollen and discolored. The skin had taken on a deep purplish hue that didn't belong on a living person. Ethan stood up. He didn't do it dramatically. No speech, no raised voice. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped into the aisle. Richard Collins noticed immediately. "Sir," Richard said sharply from the galley, "please return to your seat." Ethan ignored him and moved forward. With every step, the smell of the cabin shifted. Less champagne now. More recycled air. More metal. He stopped beside seat 1A. Up close, Alyssa looked smaller, younger. Her face was pale, almost grey, a sheen of cold sweat clinging to her skin. Her lips had a bluish tint that made Ethan's stomach drop. "Alyssa," he said quietly. He didn't know why he used her name. He had overheard it earlier. It felt important now. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. He reached out and touched her shoulder. It was cold. Alarmingly cold. Ethan's hand closed around her wrist, carefully avoiding the restraints. He searched for a pulse. It was there. Barely. Thin and rapid, like it was trying to outrun something. "Jesus," he muttered. "Sir," Richard snapped, marching toward him now, irritation hardening his features. "You need to step away from the restrained passenger." Restrained passenger. The phrase hit Ethan like a slap. She's unconscious, Ethan said, louder now. She needs medical attention. Richard glanced at Alyssa, his eyes flicking quickly over her slumped body. For a moment, something like doubt crossed his face. Then it vanished, replaced by stubborn certainty. She was fine a few minutes ago, he said. This is manipulation. Sit down. Ethan turned on him. You don't get to decide that. Look at her hands. Look at her face. Several passengers were watching now, heads tilted, phones half raised, then lowered again as if shame might be contagious. Victoria Hale leaned out from her seat. Annoyance etched deep into her expression. Is he still making a scene? She asked. Honestly, this is exhausting. Alyssa's body jerked, just once, a small, involuntary movement, like a muscle misfiring. Then she went completely limp. Her head slid sideways and struck the window with a dull, hollow sound. That was when the cabin broke. Hey, Ethan shouted. She just collapsed. He shook her gently, then harder. Nothing. She's not breathing right, he yelled. Is there a doctor on this plane? Richard froze. For half a second, the authority drained from his posture, replaced by something raw and afraid. He looked around, searching for someone else to take control. No one stepped forward. I need you to step back, he said weakly. Ethan ignored him. I'm serious. She's dying. I am a doctor. A woman's voice cut through the chaos. She was already moving down the aisle, pushing past stunned passengers. Mid-50s, composed, focused. The kind of person who had walked into crises before and did not wait for permission. I'm Dr. Elaine Porter, she said. What happened? Ethan gestured helplessly. She's been restrained for almost an hour. She passed out. Her hands are numb and swollen. Dr. Porter crouched beside Alyssa, fingers moving with practiced precision. She checked her pupils, her airway, her pulse. Then she lifted the edge of Alyssa's hoodie and stopped. There, she said sharply. A thin tube dangled loose against Alyssa's abdomen. The adhesive port had been ripped free, the skin around it red and irritated. Dr. Porter looked up, eyes blazing. She's diabetic. The word landed like the bomb. Richard staggered back half a step. That's not possible. She has an insulin pump, the doctor snapped. Or had one. It's disconnected. Her blood sugar has crashed. Ethan felt cold all over. Victoria's face drained of color. Well, how were we supposed to know? She said weakly. You were supposed to listen, the doctor shot back. Get me glucose. Now! A flight attendant scrambled for the medical kit, hands shaking as she tore it open. Dr. Porter squeezed glucose gel onto her fingers and rubbed it gently along Alyssa's gums. Captain, Richard said into his radio, panic finally breaking through his voice. We have a medical emergency. Unconscious passenger. The reply crackled through immediately. What kind of emergency? Diabetic shock, Dr. Porter shouted. She needs immediate care. We need to land. There was a pause. A long one. We're over the Atlantic, the captain said. We can't just land. Yes, you can, the doctor snapped. You can turn around, now. The cabin trembled as the plane banked sharply, fuel dumping in controlled streams away from the wings. Murmurs spread. Complaints rose. Victoria slammed her glass down. "This is unbelievable. I have an event tonight." Ethan rounded on her, fury burning through the fear. "If you say one more word, I will make sure the entire world knows exactly who you are." She shrank back, suddenly very small. In the galley, Richard collapsed onto the jump seat, head in his hands. His phone vibrated. He didn't look at it. On the tarmac back in New York, a convoy of black SUVs began to move. And in a glass tower overlooking the city, Jonathan Carter watched a video on his tablet that made the room go completely silent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move at all. "Get the car," he said finally, "and tell the pilot to park on the remote tarmac." The plane descended through thick grey clouds, the city lights coming into view below, like a constellation of consequences. Inside the cabin, Alyssa stirred faintly, her breathing uneven but present. Dr. Porter stayed with her, whispering reassurance. Ethan stood guard in the aisle, arms crossed, daring anyone to interfere again. And Richard Collins stared at the rain streaking down the window, the weight of what he had done settling into his bones as the plane touched down, carrying far more than passengers back to the ground. The plane rolled to a stop far from the terminal, the engines winding down into an uneasy hush that pressed against every ear in the cabin. Rain hammered the fuselage, steady and relentless, as if the sky itself was impatient. The captain's voice came over the intercom, stripped of its earlier authority, edged now with something brittle. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We've been instructed to hold position." Richard Collins unbuckled his harness and stood, smoothing his jacket with trembling hands. He forced his shoulders back, the old reflex of control kicking in. Whatever was happening outside, he told himself, it was procedure. Medical emergencies happened. He had followed protocol. He repeated the words in his head like a prayer. In seat 1A, Alyssa lay reclined now, blankets piled over her thin frame. Her color had returned slightly, enough to keep her alive, not enough to make her whole. Dr. Porter monitored her breathing, one hand resting lightly on Alyssa's shoulder, grounding her with touch. Ethan stood nearby, eyes fixed on the front door. He saw them before anyone else did. The flashing lights cut through the rain first. Red, blue. Not the familiar pattern of airport police vehicles, but something heavier, purposeful. A line of black SUVs rolled onto the tarmac, tires spraying water as they fanned out with military precision. Behind them, a mobile staircase raced toward the plane, far larger than necessary, its presence deliberate. A murmur swept through the cabin. "What is this?" someone whispered. Victoria Hale leaned forward, peering through the window, her earlier confidence cracking. "Is this for her?" she asked, incredulous. "What did she do?" Richard felt a flicker of relief. This had to be it. Federal authorities, watch lists, something he hadn't known. Something that would justify everything. He straightened. "Remain calm," he said loudly, reclaiming his professional tone. "This appears to be a security matter." The staircase locked into place with a metallic clang that echoed through the cabin. The door opened. They didn't ask permission. 2 men in dark tactical gear stepped inside, moving with the quiet certainty of people who were never told no. Their eyes swept the cabin in a single pass, cataloguing faces, exits, threats. They did not look at Richard. Behind them came a 3rd man. He moved slower, deliberate, tall, broad-shouldered. A charcoal suit soaked through at the edges from the rain, but worn as if discomfort were beneath notice. His face was carved from restraint, every line controlled, every expression held in check. Jonathan Carter stepped into the cabin. The air changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of shift you felt in your chest before you understood it with your mind. Conversations died instantly. Phones froze mid-motion. Even the rain seemed to soften, as if listening. Jonathan's eyes moved across the seats without stopping. Past Victoria, past Richard, past the curious and the afraid, until they found 1A. They broke then. He crossed the distance in long strides and dropped to his knees beside Alyssa, the power in his body folding inward, focused entirely on the girl in front of him. "Allie," he whispered. The sound cracked. "I'm here." Alyssa's eyes fluttered open. Confusion clouded her gaze before recognition cut through it. "Dad?" she murmured, the word barely audible. Jonathan's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear he hadn't realized was there. "You're okay," he said, voice trembling despite his effort to control it. "You're safe now." Dr. Porter looked up at him, reading his face in seconds. "She needs to get to a hospital," she said. "Now." Jonathan nodded once. "She will." He stood slowly, the tenderness draining from his expression as he turned. Richard took an instinctive step forward. "Sir," he began, forcing authority into his voice, "you can't be here. This passenger is in custody for—" Jonathan looked at him. It wasn't anger yet. It was worse. It was assessment. "In custody," Jonathan repeated softly. "Yes," Richard said, swallowing. "She assaulted a crew member and attempted to." Jonathan raised a hand. Silence fell so completely it felt enforced. "You restrained a minor," Jonathan said. "You ignored a medical emergency. You nearly killed my daughter." The word daughter rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Victoria's clutch slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a hollow thud. Richard's mouth opened, closed, his face drained of color. "Your daughter?" Jonathan reached into his jacket and produced a black card, holding it up just long enough for the insignia to register. "Do you know who owns this airline?" he asked quietly. Richard's knees buckled. He grabbed the galley counter to stay upright. "You," he whispered. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. "Yes." He turned slightly, gesturing. The men in tactical gear moved instantly, flanking Richard with unyielding hands. "Mr. Collins," a man in a blue suit stepped forward, tablet in hand. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Federal charges are pending. You will cooperate." Richard cried, panic finally spilling free. "I was following procedure." She didn't look. Jonathan stepped closer. Finish that sentence, he said. Richard couldn't. Jonathan turned his gaze to Victoria. You, he said. She shrank back, colour draining from her face. I didn't know, she stammered. You thought she didn't belong, Jonathan said, because of how she looked. Victoria nodded weakly. You instigated this, Jonathan continued, and now you will leave. But my ticket is cancelled, Jonathan said, and so is every privilege you think you're entitled to. She was escorted out, heels slipping on the wet steps, humiliation clinging to her like the rain. Jonathan turned back to the cabin. This crew is suspended, he said evenly. This aircraft is grounded. Paramedics moved in, lifting Alyssa onto a stretcher. Jonathan walked beside her, never letting go of her hand. As they carried her toward the waiting vehicles, Jonathan paused at the door and looked back once more. Some of you saw what happened, he said. Some of you recorded it. Some of you said nothing. His gaze swept the cabin. History will remember who you were. The door closed behind him, leaving the cabin in stunned silence, the rain still falling, washing away nothing at all. The hospital room didn't smell like antiseptic so much as quiet money. Fresh lilies crowded the windowsill. White orchids lined the counter, beside a muted television. The private suite overlooked Central Park, its lights glowing softly against the rain-soaked city. Machines hummed with disciplined restraint, each beep measured, controlled, alive. Alyssa lay in the bed, eyes open now, staring at the ceiling as if it might explain what had happened to her. Her wrists were wrapped in gauze. Faint bruises bloomed beneath the bandages, dark fingerprints that refused to fade quickly. Her hands still tingled, half numb, half aching, like they belonged to someone else. Jonathan Carter sat in the leather chair beside her bed, jacket draped over the back, sleeves rolled up. He hadn't slept. He hadn't left. His phone rested in his palm, screen lighting up every few seconds with messages he did not open. You should rest, he said softly, for the third time. Alyssa swallowed. Every time I close my eyes, she whispered, I hear the click. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He nodded once. I know. She turned her head toward him, finally meeting his eyes. They really thought I was lying? He exhaled slowly. They didn't think, he said. They assumed. Silence stretched between them, heavy, but not empty. Outside, a siren wailed, then faded. On the television, a news anchor's voice cut through. The volume was low, but the headline was clear. Teen passenger restrained in first-class cabin. Airline under fire. Alyssa flinched. Jonathan reached for the remote and turned the volume down further. Not off, just enough. They're already picking sides, Alyssa said. I can feel it. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The same city that had crowned him. The same city that now watched his daughter bleed in public. They always do, he said, finally. The door opened quietly. Arthur Reed stepped inside, tablet tucked under his arm. Early 50s, steel-grey hair. A face trained to remain neutral when delivering bad news. It's escalating, Arthur said without preamble. Jonathan turned. How bad? Arthur set the tablet down and turned the screen toward them. Social media feeds scrolled endlessly. Videos, hashtags, edited clips, slow-motion replays of Alyssa being restrained, her hoodie twisted, her face pale. Some captions were supportive, furious, outraged. Others were not. She shouldn't have argued. Follow instructions and this doesn't happen. Playing victim. Alyssa closed her eyes. Arthur continued. Richard Collins retained counsel this morning. He's claiming he followed protocol and feared for Mukbin's safety. Jonathan laughed once. There was no humor in it. And Victoria Hale, Arthur added, is shopping interviews. Alyssa's eyes snapped open. What? She's framing herself as distressed, Arthur said. Says the incident caused her severe anxiety. Claims she felt threatened. Threatened, Alyssa thought. By a girl reading a paperback. Jonathan's voice was calm, but it had gone cold. Let them talk. Arthur hesitated. There's more. Jonathan looked at him. Say it. Arthur inhaled. The airline's interim leadership is preparing a statement. They're leaning toward calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. Alyssa's chest tightened. They're going to bury it. They're going to try, Jonathan said. He walked back to Alyssa's bedside and rested a hand lightly on the blanket, grounding both of them. They think this ends with an apology and a settlement, he continued. They think money makes noise go away. Alyssa looked up at him. Doesn't it? Jonathan met her gaze. For the first time since boarding that plane, his expression softened into something like pride. Not this time. Arthur cleared his throat. There's also the video. Jonathan nodded. Ethan Brooks. Arthur raised an eyebrow. You know him? I know courage when I see it. Jonathan picked up his phone and finally unlocked it. He tapped a number. Ethan answered on the second ring, voice tight. Mr. Carter. Jonathan, he said. You did the right thing. There was a pause on the other end. I didn't do enough. You did everything, Jonathan replied. And you didn't look away. Ethan swallowed audibly. They're coming after me, online, he admitted. Saying I staged it. That I wanted attention. Jonathan's voice was steady. That will stop. He ended the call and turned back to Arthur. Bring him in. I want him protected. Arthur nodded, already typing. On the television, the headline changed. Exclusive interview tonight. Flight attendant speaks out. Alyssa sat up suddenly, wincing as pain flared through her wrists. They're lying, she said, voice shaking for the first time. They're lying about me. Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed, close enough now that she could feel his presence, solid and immovable. I know, he said. Why do people believe them? She asked. Why do they need me to be wrong? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He thought of boardrooms, of headlines, of the way power was always assumed to belong to someone else. Because if you're right, he said quietly, then the system is wrong. Alyssa stared at the screen, watching her own fear loop endlessly for strangers to dissect. I just wanted to fly, she whispered. I wanted to feel normal. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, the softness was gone. "They made a mistake," he said. "Not restraining you, not humiliating you." Alyssa looked at him. "They made the mistake of doubling down," Jonathan continued. "They went public." Arthur stiffened. "You think they'll escalate?" "I know they will," Jonathan said. "People like that always do when they think they're losing control." Alyssa searched his face. "What happens now?" Jonathan leaned closer, his voice low, controlled, absolute. "Now," he said, "we stop playing defense." The television flickered as the anchor's voice rose. "This case is dividing public opinion," she said. "Some argue the crew acted appropriately under pressure." Jonathan picked up the remote and turned the screen off. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the monitor. "They wanted a story," Jonathan said. "They're going to get it one." Alyssa took a slow breath. The pain was still there, the fear too. But beneath it, something else stirred, something steadier. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently, careful of the bandages. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we take everything back." Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that somewhere above it, a line had been crossed that would not be erased quietly. The press conference started exactly at 9 in the morning, which told Jonathan Carter everything he needed to know. Richard Collins stood at the podium in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders, the fabric hanging loose as if the weight of the last 48 hours had shrunk him. His hair was uncombed. His eyes were red, tired in a way that looked practiced. Beside him sat his attorney, a man with a sharp jaw and a smoother voice, already leaning toward the microphones like this was his natural habitat. "My client is a dedicated professional," the lawyer began, hands folded calmly. "He followed training designed to protect passengers and crew. He did not know the passenger's identity, nor her medical condition." In the hospital suite, Jonathan watched the broadcast without blinking. Alyssa sat upright in bed now, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, wrists still bandaged. She hadn't wanted to watch. Jonathan had insisted. "You need to see how they do it," he had said, "so it doesn't surprise you." On the screen, Richard dabbed at his eyes. "I was scared," he said, voice cracking. She refused instructions. "I feared for the safety of the cabin." Alyssa's fingers curled into the blanket. "She didn't raise her voice," Alyssa said quietly. "I didn't move." Jonathan nodded. "Facts don't matter in the opening statement." The lawyer leaned back in, voice smooth. "This has become a case of a powerful billionaire using influence to destroy a working-class man." Alyssa inhaled sharply. "They're turning it around." "Yes," Jonathan said. "They're betting people prefer that story." The camera cut to a split screen. On one side, Richard, fragile and remorseful. On the other, a looping clip of Alyssa restrained in her seat, frozen at the worst possible moment. The chyron read, "Airline incident raises questions about crew authority." Alyssa shook her head. "They're saying I attacked him." Jonathan picked up his phone. "Arthur," he said when the line connected. "It's time." Arthur's voice came through crisp. "We're ready." Jonathan hung up and turned to Alyssa. "You trust me?" She met his eyes. "I trust you." "Then stay here," he said, "and don't watch anything else." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room with purpose. 2 hours later, a very different press conference was unfolding in a private lounge at JFK. No podium, no cheap microphones, just a long table, polished wood, soft lighting. Jonathan sat at the center, Arthur to his right, Ethan Brooks to his left. Ethan looked uncomfortable in a suit. He kept adjusting the cuff, grounding himself with small movements. Jonathan didn't speak right away. He waited until the room settled, until every camera was fixed, until silence leaned in. "My daughter was restrained on a plane she had a valid ticket for," he said. His voice was calm, measured, carrying without effort. She was 18 years old. She complied with every lawful request. She posed no threat. He paused. What happened to her was not an accident. Arthur tapped his tablet once. Screens behind them lit up. Internal training documents filled the display. Highlighted passages. Phrases like profile assessment, cabin integrity, discretion encouraged. Jonathan continued. This airline trained its crew to make judgments based on appearance, not behavior, not evidence. The room shifted. Ethan leaned forward. "I recorded the incident because I knew no one would believe her otherwise," he said. "And I was right." Another tap, audio played. Richard's voice, clear, confident. "If she looks like she doesn't belong, remove her. Use restraints if necessary." Gasps rippled through the room. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. This was not one man's decision. It was policy. A reporter stood. "Are you accusing the airline of systemic discrimination?" Jonathan met her gaze. "I'm stating a fact." Phones buzzed. Alerts fired. Arthur leaned in. "The executive responsible for in-flight operations approved this training." Jonathan nodded. "He will be addressed." Back at the hospital, Alyssa watched nothing. She lay back, eyes on the ceiling, breathing slowly, letting her body catch up with the reality that she was safe. Her phone buzzed. "Ethan. It's happening." She closed her eyes. Across town, in a glass-walled conference room, the executive in question watched the press conference on mute, his face pale. His assistant hovered near the door. "They have audio," she whispered. He swallowed. "That's impossible." His phone rang. Jonathan Carter. He didn't answer. The call ended. Another came. This one from the board. He answered that one. By evening, the airline stock had dropped double digits. Advertisers pulled campaigns. Advocacy groups mobilized. Politicians demanded investigations. Richard Collins' attorney released a statement distancing himself from prior claims. Victoria Hale deleted her social media accounts. In the hospital suite, Arthur returned. "They're suspending all involved executives," he said. "Federal investigations are opening." Alyssa nodded slowly. "And him?" Arthur hesitated. "Richard has been charged." Alyssa closed her eyes. She felt no relief, only a strange, heavy quiet. Jonathan sat beside her again, the storm outside finally breaking. "They tried to make you small," he said. "They failed." Alyssa turned to him. "It still happened." "Yes," Jonathan said. "And that matters." She studied her bandaged wrists. "What if this happens to someone else who doesn't have you?" Jonathan's gaze sharpened. "Then we change the system." Outside the window, the city lights came on, one by one, illuminating streets filled with people who had watched, judged, argued, and moved on. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. They thought this would be contained. Alyssa looked at him. "It's not." "No," he agreed. "It's just beginning." The monitor beeped steadily, a reminder of survival, as the world outside reckoned with the cost of a single assumption made at 30,000 feet. The boardroom smelled like burnt coffee and panic. The long glass table reflected a dozen anxious faces, each one lit by the glow of tablets, streaming the same footage on loop. Headlines stacked on top of headlines. Investigations, congressional inquiries, class action threats. The story had outgrown the plane, the airport, even the airline. It had become a mirror, and no one liked what it showed. At the head of the table, the interim chief executive cleared his throat for the third time in 5 minutes. No one looked at him. The door opened without a knock. Jonathan Carter walked in, as if the room already belonged to him. Conversations died instantly. Chairs shifted. Someone's pen clattered to the floor. He didn't sit. "Before anyone speaks," Jonathan said, voice even. "Understand this. I am not here to negotiate." Silence pressed down harder than any raised voice could have. The interim CEO tried anyway. "Jonathan, we understand emotions are high, but—" Jonathan lifted a single finger. "My daughter was restrained," he said. "She lost consciousness. She almost died. That is not an emotional event. That is a fact." No one interrupted him again. "I have reviewed your internal communications," he continued, "your training manuals, your emails, your private message boards. I know exactly how long this culture has existed and how many people knew about it." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "We are prepared to issue a formal apology and a substantial settlement." Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're still thinking in numbers." He turned slightly, nodding once toward the door. Arthur Reed entered, followed by 2 federal agents. The temperature in the room dropped. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur said calmly, "these agents are here to serve warrants related to obstruction, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations." Chairs scraped back. Someone cursed under their breath. Jonathan didn't look away from the board. "You trained your people to decide who belongs. Today that ends." An executive near the far end stood abruptly. "You can't just dismantle an entire operation over one incident." Jonathan's eyes finally hardened. This wasn't one incident. This was the one that got recorded. The man sat back down. Outside the boardroom, cameras waited. Protesters gathered. The world watched the slow collapse of something that had been rotting quietly for years. By nightfall, The airline issued a statement announcing the suspension of its in-flight services division, the resignation of multiple executives, and full cooperation with federal authorities. It wasn't enough. Jonathan knew it. Alyssa knew it. And so did everyone who had ever been told in one way or another that they did not belong. 2 days later, Alyssa left the hospital. She wore the same hoodie. Not as a statement. Not as defiance. Simply because it was comfortable. And she refused to let fear decide something as small as what she put on her body. Outside, reporters shouted questions she didn't answer. Cameras flashed. She kept her head up, eyes forward, one hand wrapped loosely around Jonathan's arm. At home, she slept for 12 hours straight. When she woke, the world was different. Her phone was full. Messages from strangers, from people who looked like her, from people who didn't. Stories poured in. Not all identical, but close enough to hurt. First class, boardrooms, stores, schools. Same look, same tone, same assumption. Alyssa sat on the edge of her bed and read until her chest ached. Downstairs, Jonathan paced. Arthur watched him carefully. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You've already won." Jonathan stopped. "No. I've been exposed." Arthur raised an eyebrow. Jonathan turned. "I own planes, buildings, companies, and I still sent my daughter into a system that almost killed her because I assumed money would protect her." Arthur said nothing. Jonathan's voice lowered. It didn't. That afternoon, Jonathan made the call that no one expected. He didn't announce it. He didn't float it to investors. He simply did it. The airline brand would be dissolved. A new entity would replace it. New leadership. New training. New accountability, written into code and contracts, not press releases. When the news broke, the reaction was immediate. Analysts called it reckless. Commentators called it dramatic. Shareholders panicked. Jonathan didn't respond. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with Alyssa, laptops open between them. "I don't want them to just apologize," she said quietly. "I want them to change." Jonathan studied her face, the steadiness in her eyes, the clarity forged by fear and survival. "Then help me build it," he said. She looked up. "Me?" "You saw it from the seat," he replied. "They never do." The next week, Ethan Brooks walked into a temporary office overlooking the Hudson, still not quite sure how he'd ended up there. Jonathan stood to greet him. "You ready to be uncomfortable for a while?" Ethan laughed nervously. "I think that already happened." Jonathan gestured to the city beyond the glass. "We're building something that watches the system while it watches people." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then let's do it right." Across the country, Richard Collins sat alone in a small apartment, the television on but muted. His phone buzzed once, then went silent again. No more interviews, no more sympathy, just consequences. Victoria Hale resurfaced briefly in a carefully staged apology video. It was met with silence. The world had moved on. Alyssa stood in her bedroom that night, suitcase open on the bed. School resumed in a few days. London waited. Jonathan watched from the doorway. "You don't have to fly yet," he said. "We can delay." Alyssa shook her head. "No, I won't let it end like that." She zipped the bag and looked at him. "I want to go back up." Jonathan nodded, pride and fear twisting together in his chest. Outside, planes crossed the sky in steady lines, indifferent to the stories unfolding beneath them. But one seat on one future flight would never feel the same again. Not for the people who watched, not for the people who stayed silent, and not for the girl who learned, far too young, what it costs when a system decides you don't belong. 6 months later, the hangar at JFK no longer carried the old logo. The paint had been stripped clean, metal gleaming under white floodlights, the aircraft standing silent and enormous, its new markings sharp and understated. No gold trim, no language of privilege, just a name designed to mean assent without exclusion. Alyssa stood at the edge of the runway, hands in the pockets of her hoodie, the wind tugging at the loose fabric like it always did. The smell of fuel and rain brought the memory back before she could stop it. The restraint click, the pressure on her wrists, the way the cabin had gone quiet. Her breath caught. Just for a second. "You don't have to do this today," Jonathan said beside her. She shook her head slowly. "Yes, I do." Behind them, the crowd was assembling. Reporters, regulators, industry leaders who had flown in on private jets to witness what they assumed was another rebrand, another billionaire vanity project. None of them yet understood that this wasn't about planes. It was about power. Ethan Brooks adjusted the microphone cables on the temporary stage, his movements precise, focused. He looked different now. Not wealthier, not louder, just steadier. Like someone who had learned what mattered and refused to unlearn it. He caught Alyssa's eye and nodded. She nodded back. Jonathan stepped forward first. He didn't wait for applause. "This airline," he said, voice carrying easily across the tarmac, "does not exist because a brand failed. It exists because a system failed." The murmurs quieted. "For decades," Jonathan continued, "we taught our employees to protect comfort instead of dignity, to trust appearance instead of truth, and we rewarded them for it." Alyssa felt every word land in her chest, not as pain this time, as acknowledgement. Jonathan turned slightly, gesturing toward her. "6 months ago, my daughter boarded a flight wearing a hoodie and carrying a book. She had a valid ticket. She followed every instruction, and she was restrained anyway. Cameras clicked. She survived," Jonathan said. "Many do not." Alyssa stepped forward then. The movement surprised even her. The microphone felt cold in her hands. She took a breath and let it ground her. "I didn't know who my dad was to them," she said, "and I shouldn't have needed them to know." Her voice was steady now, stronger than she felt. "I was scared," she continued. "But what scared me more was realizing how normal it all felt, how easy it was for people to decide I didn't belong without ever asking who I was." She looked out at the faces watching her, some curious, some uncomfortable, some defensive. "This airline isn't about making people feel special," Alyssa said. "It's about making sure no one is treated as disposable." Silence followed. Real silence, the kind that meant people were listening. Jonathan nodded once. Ethan stepped up next, his voice less polished but no less sure. We're implementing systems that remove discretion where bias hides. Medical alerts flagged instantly. Ticket verification that doesn't rely on judgment calls. Body cameras for crew during conflicts. Independent oversight. A reporter raised a hand. What if that slows operations? Ethan met his gaze. Then we slow down. That earned a ripple of reaction. When the ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed in fragments of conversation, analysis already forming headlines. Alyssa stayed where she was, watching the aircraft. Jonathan joined her again. "You okay?" She nodded. "I think so." "You don't have to fly today," he repeated gently. Alyssa smiled faintly. "You already said that." They walked together toward the stairs. No rush, no spectacle. Just movement. Inside the cabin, everything felt different. Same layout, same seat numbers. But the air was lighter, less performative, less watched. Alyssa paused at the front row. Seat 1, A. She hesitated, feeling the weight of it press in from all sides. Then she sat down. The leather was cool beneath her hands, the window bright with afternoon light. She buckled her seatbelt and rested her palms on her thighs, breathing slowly. A flight attendant approached. Early 20s, nervous, kind. "Can I get you anything?" she asked. Alyssa met her eyes, really looked at her. "Just water, please." The attendant smiled. "Of course." As she walked away, Alyssa felt something loosen in her chest. Jonathan settled into the adjacent seat. "Ready?" Alyssa nodded. "Yeah." The engines hummed to life. As the plane began to taxi, Alyssa watched the ground fall away through the window, the lines of the runway blurring into something abstract and distant. She thought of the people who had stayed silent, the ones who had spoken up, the ones who would never know her name, but would feel the change anyway. When the plane lifted off, the city shrinking beneath them, Alyssa closed her eyes. Not to escape, but to remember that fear didn't get to decide where she belonged. Not anymore. The verdict came down on a Tuesday afternoon, quiet enough to feel unreal. Alyssa was in a study room at school when her phone vibrated. No dramatic notification, no banner headline. Just a message from Arthur that said, "It's over. Guilty on all counts." She stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it and setting the phone face down on the table. Outside the window, students crossed the quad, laughing, complaining about exams, living inside a world that had kept moving, while hers had cracked open and reassembled itself piece by piece. She didn't feel relief, not the way people expected. What she felt was gravity. Across town, Jonathan sat alone in his office. The city stretched beneath him like a map of consequences. The jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours. Video evidence, audio, policy documents. It had been airtight. Richard Collins would serve time. Not symbolic time. Real time. Years measured not in press cycles, but in locked doors and routines. he did not control. Jonathan closed his eyes. It didn't bring satisfaction. It brought finality. The second verdict followed weeks later. Federal court, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, conspiracy. The executive who had authored the policies resigned in handcuffs, his face blank as cameras flashed. He had once spoken about efficiency and brand integrity. Now he said nothing at all. The system had names now, faces, paper trails, and it had consequences. Alyssa watched the coverage from her dorm room, legs tucked beneath her, hoodie wrapped tight around her shoulders. She muted the television halfway through a panel discussion, arguing whether accountability had gone too far. Too far. She shut the screen off completely. Her roommate looked up from her desk. "You okay?" Alyssa nodded. "Yeah. Just tired." It was the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough. Sleep came easier these days, not uninterrupted, not gentle. But it came. And when the dreams showed up, they didn't stay as long. One afternoon, Alyssa found herself back at JFK. No cameras this time, no speeches, just a quiet gate and a late flight heading west. She moved through the terminal without being recognized, her name no longer trending, her face no longer a symbol for strangers to project onto. At the gate, she sat and watched people, a father juggling a toddler and a backpack, a woman in scrubs rubbing her temples, a couple arguing in whispers, ordinary moments stacked on top of one another. This was what she had wanted. Not invisibility. Normalcy. When boarding was called, she stood and joined the line. The jet bridge hummed softly beneath her feet. The aircraft door stood open, neutral, indifferent. Inside, a flight attendant smiled and greeted her without hesitation. "Welcome aboard." Alyssa returned the smile and stepped inside. Her seat wasn't 1A this time. It didn't need to be. She sat, buckled in, and exhaled as the plane pushed back from the gate. Somewhere over the Midwest, turbulence rattled the cabin. The seatbelt sign chimed on. A murmur of irritation rippled through the rows. Alyssa felt her chest tighten. Just a little. She closed her eyes and counted her breaths. In, out. The plane steadied. The moment passed. Across the aisle, a man caught her eye and gave a small, reassuring nod. No words, no assumptions, just recognition. It mattered more than he would ever know. Weeks later, Alyssa stood at a podium she had not asked for, facing a room full of people who had. Students, advocates, professionals who wanted her story distilled into lessons, bullet points, best practices. She didn't give them that. "I don't want to be brave," she said instead. "I want to be believed without having to be." The room went still. "Change doesn't happen because one person suffers loudly enough," she continued. "It happens because systems are forced to stop pretending they don't see what they're doing." Afterward, a woman approached her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "This happened to my son," she said. "Years ago. We didn't have proof." Alyssa took her hand. "I know." They stood there together for a moment, connected by something heavy and unfixable and real. Jonathan watched from the back of the room. Later that night, he and Alyssa walked along the river. the city lights reflected in broken patterns on the water. He hadn't spoken much since the verdicts. He didn't need to. "I used to think justice was about winning," he said finally. "I was wrong." Alyssa glanced at him. "What is it then?" Jonathan considered. "Making sure it doesn't happen again." She nodded. They stopped at the railing, watching a boat cut through the dark water, its wake spreading outward, touching places the vessel itself would never reach. "Do you ever wish it hadn't been you?" Jonathan asked quietly. Alyssa thought of the seat, the restraints, the silence. "Yes," she said, "and no." Jonathan waited. "Yes, because it hurt," she continued. "No, because if it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else, and maybe no one would have listened." Jonathan swallowed. Alyssa turned to him. "I don't want this to be my whole life." "It won't be," he said. "But it will be part of it." She nodded again. In a small apartment miles away, Richard Collins stared at the ceiling of his cell, counting cracks he hadn't noticed the day before. No television, no audience, just time. He thought about the girl in the hoodie, about the moment he could have stopped, about how easy it had been to believe the uniform made him right. The thought followed him into sleep. Alyssa boarded another flight 2 months later, then another, each one a little easier than the last. She learned to trust her body again, to trust the space around her, to trust that silence didn't always mean danger. One evening, high above the clouds, she looked out the window and saw the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in layers of orange and violet. She rested her forehead against the glass and smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because she had learned that survival could look like forward motion, and that was enough. The flight landed just after sunset, the wheels touching down with a familiar thud that no longer made Alyssa's chest tighten. She stayed seated for a moment after the seatbelt sign went off, watching the cabin rise around her in a choreography she had once associated with danger. People reached for bags, conversations resumed, life continued in small, ordinary gestures. No one was watching her. She stood when it felt right, stepped into the aisle, and followed the slow, patient line toward the door. The jet bridge air rushed in cool and metallic, carrying the faint smell of rain and fuel. Another arrival. Another ending that wasn't really an ending at all. Outside the terminal, Jonathan waited a few steps back from the crowd, hands in his coat pockets, posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been in a long time. When Alyssa spotted him, she smiled first. It surprised both of them. "You okay?" he said quietly as she reached him. "I am," she answered, and this time it didn't feel like a promise she was making to survive the moment. It felt like a fact. They walked together through the terminal, past advertisements and departure boards and people rushing toward places that mattered urgently to them. Alyssa caught fragments of conversations as they passed, complaints about delays, excitement about reunions, a child asking if planes ever got tired of flying. She thought about that for a second. Maybe they did. Maybe they just learned how to keep going anyway. Outside, the city wrapped around them in lights and noise, indifferent and alive. A car door closed. Traffic hummed. Somewhere above, another plane crossed the sky, carrying a story she would never know. Jonathan opened the door for her, a small habit that had taken on new weight since everything happened. She slid into the seat and rested her head back, watching the city move past the window. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said as the car pulled away. Alyssa nodded. "I know." She meant it. In the weeks that followed, the world found new stories to argue about. Headlines shifted, outrage moved on. The airline industry adjusted its language, its training, its public commitments. Some changes were real, some were cosmetic. Alyssa learned to tell the difference. She went to class. She missed deadlines and made them up. She laughed with friends who knew parts of her story and friends who didn't. She learned that healing didn't arrive all at once, but in moments so small they were easy to miss. A quiet flight, a kind smile, a seat that was just a seat. Sometimes when she boarded a plane, she still felt the memory rise up, sharp and uninvited. She let it come. She didn't fight it anymore. Fear lost its power when it wasn't treated like a secret. Jonathan watched her from a careful distance, proud and humbled in equal measure. He spoke less in meetings now, listened more. When he talked about leadership, it sounded different, less abstract, more human. The system had changed, but not because it had been convinced. It had been exposed, and exposure, Alyssa had learned, was a form of truth that didn't fade easily. One evening, months later, she sat alone in her room, laptop open, the soft glow of the screen reflecting in the window. The video was still there, the one Ethan had filmed, still shared, still watched, still commented on by strangers who would never meet her, but felt entitled to decide what her experience meant. She didn't read the comments anymore. She closed the tab and leaned back in her chair, breathing slowly. Outside, the city settled into night, lights flickering on one by one, like signals that said, "Keep going." She picked up her phone and typed a message to Ethan. "Still flying?" He replied a moment later. "Good." Alyssa smiled and set the phone down. Her story was no longer just about what had been done to her. It was about what she had refused to accept quietly. It was about the people who had spoken up when it would have been easier not to. It was about systems that relied on silence and what happened when that silence broke. It was bigger than her now, and somehow that made it lighter to carry. If you stayed with this story until the end, you already understand that moments like these aren't rare. They just aren't always recorded. They aren't always believed. And they don't always end with accountability. But sometimes they do. If this story moved you, support it by pressing like and subscribing to the channel so these stories keep being told. And if you want to be part of the conversation, leave a comment with 3 simple words. I would stand.